The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the very kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. It's great to see you all and to have this chance of sharing some of my work with you. Let me just share my screen real quick. All right, can you see the slides? Perfect. Nice. All right. So, as the title of the talk suggests, this is going to be predominantly a methodological talk, or at least the main purpose is to make a methodological argument. And the methodological argument I want to make today is quite simple. By combining corpus-assisted discourse analysis methods with experiments, we can go beyond simple description of linguistic patterns and begin to show and explain the effects of linguistic choices on people. Now, corpus-assisted discourse studies, or CADS, as it's often referred to, emerged in the late 90s and early 2000s when two traditions of linguistic research came together, corpus linguistics on one hand and critical discourse analysis on the other. Now, CADS partly arose in response to criticisms that were made against CDA, especially in relation to issues like cherry picking of examples, researcher bias, and the small number of texts that were typically considered by CDA researchers at that time. Corpus methods were promoted as a way of overcoming some of these issues. The idea being that by looking at a larger collection of texts and by using automated analysis techniques, researchers could be more objective and support their critical analysis with more robust empirical evidence. Now, these are some of the reasons why in a seminal paper, which I'm sure you all will have read by Baker and colleagues, the combination of corpus and experimental methods was promoted as a useful methodological synergy. Now, since the early 2000s, and especially in the past few years, the field of corpus-assisted discourse studies has flourished. This methodological approach has been used to study a wide variety of topics and to examine the linguistic underpinnings of a wide range of important societal issues, including, for instance, immigration, climate change, denialism, obesity, and other healthcare-related concerns. Now, one of the central tenets of CDA, which it shares with critical discourse analysis more generally, is that the way that we conventionally talk about things in the world influences the way we think and feel about those things. This is why CADS is interested in exploring so-called discourses, which essentially are conventionalized ways of talking about things that both shape and are shaped by conventional ways of thinking, like discourses of obesity or discourses of climate change denialism. And the central idea in CADS is that the linguistic choices that are made in the texts that we're exposed to carry ideology. And these linguistic choices can contribute to perpetuating certain attitudes and worldviews, often to the detriment of vulnerable groups in society. Now, in our everyday lives, we get exposed to and consume a lot of texts, and the language contained in those texts, such as news and social media texts, influences the way we think and act in the world. So the idea is that if we see a lot of one particular way of talking about a particular group or issue, then there is sometimes almost a deterministic assumption that that reflects the way people think. However, here is the problem. This causal link between language and thought and between language and behavior is treated in a lot of CDA and a lot of CADS studies so far as a given and is rarely, if ever, tested empirically. This is the issue that I'm sort of developing my argument around today. Now, as Michael Stubbs back in 1997 put it, there must be non-linguistic evidence of a pattern of beliefs and behavior. If we have no independent evidence, but infer beliefs from language use, then the theory is circular. Note that this comment was a criticism of CDA, and it is interesting to see that it came from a corpus linguist. Now, what I'm arguing here is that more than 25 years on, this issue is still largely valid, and it applies to CADS studies just as much as it does to CDA, because they both rely on linguistic description only. Along similar lines, this is a quote from Ruth Breeze, also critiquing CDA. CDA lacks a cogent theory of audience effects and audience response that would provide support for its assertions about the influence of discourses on human subjects. And again, this criticism applies to CDA just as much as it applies to CADS, because even though CADS does look at a larger and more representative sample of language use and uses quantitative methods as a source of empirical evidence, it still relies exclusively on linguistic analysis and cannot offer independent, non-linguistic evidence of patterns of thought and behavior. So the main point I want to make here on the basis of this is that corpus methods alone can only get us so far and are insufficient to support claims about discourse effects. To properly and empirically test these effects, the real effects of language use on people's thinking, attitudes, and behavior, we do need to incorporate other methods. Now, I am advocating for the use of experiments as an additional source of evidence. But of course, there are other methods that can be used to achieve a similar goal, including ethnographic data collection, qualitative interviews, and to some extent also having multiple analysts look at the same set of data. But the points that I want to really press here is that only by incorporating these other methods, we can finally properly tackle the processes of discourse interpretation, which are fundamental, as Fairclough already argued in his work, but are still quite understudied. And so to get to a fuller understanding of discourse as a social practice, we do need to tackle this aspect of it more seriously. So what I'm going to do in the rest of this talk is show you a couple of recent studies that I've done that combine corpus and experimental methods. And the main purpose of this is not so much to discuss the results of these studies per se. In fact, I won't have a lot of time to do that. But it's to provide a practical illustration of how this mixed methods approach works. I'm going to start with a case study that looks at deceptive trust building in corporate discourse. And then I'm going to move on to a more recent study where we looked at how blame spreads on Twitter. And this is the workflow that I would like to promote here. And that is also the workflow that I used and we used in these studies. So first, we carry out a corpus-assisted discourse analysis on a set of texts. This is, by nature, exploratory, and it's aimed at finding patterns. It can only be exploratory because we're working with observational data, and there can be many confounds that explain the patterns that we're seeing in this data. So we cannot really use observational data to test hypotheses about patterns of thought. Crucially, the results of the corpus study are then treated as hypotheses, which we then test in a follow-up experimental study. The experimental study is confirmatory. It's used to we're not interested in describing patterns of language use anymore, but in testing the effects of linguistic choices. So the first study that I'd like to present is one that I did a few years ago. This is a two-part study. The first part is a corpus-assisted analysis of trust-building rhetorical strategies used in corporate reports. And the second part of the study is an experiment that I did in collaboration with Chris Hart from Lancaster University, where we took two of the most frequent trust-building strategies that we identified in the corpus study and tested their effects. So let me talk you through these two different parts in turn. So the corpus study investigates specifically how stance constructions are used in annual and corporate social responsibility reports to build a trustworthy corporate identity. Now, annual reports, for those of you who are not familiar with these texts, are documents published by large corporations annually that discuss a company's finances. CSR reports, on the other hand, are addressed at a wider audience and talk about environmental, social, and ethical issues. So in the study, I was interested in looking at how stance features are used rhetorically and persuasively in these texts to convince readers that the company can be trusted. So for this purpose, I built a specialized corpus of annual and CSR reports by 16 companies operating in 4 industries: financial services, oil and gas, pharmaceuticals, and food processing. And the analysis focused on grammatical stance, that is, constructions where some kind of evaluative word or expression takes scope over a proposition. Let me just give you an example of that to clarify what kind of feature we were interested in. So I used the framework developed by Douglas Piber and colleagues for the analysis of stance. And according to this framework, there are 3 major categories of evaluative language. We have attitudinal stance. This is evaluative language that is used to express positive or negative opinions and assessments and emotions. I am proud to be on this team in this case. Then we have epistemic stance, which is about it's the language that we use to express how committed we are to a particular claim. The stance category then has the stance framework has a third category, which is modality, which is treated separately from these 2 other types of stance in Piber's framework. All right, so we applied this, and I'm not going to go into the how we did it, but it's described in the paper in a fair amount of detail. But let me just give you a couple of key findings, mainly to show you how we went from the corpus study to the experiment. Not necessarily to discuss these findings for what they are, but of course I'm happy to take questions if you have any later on. Now, one of the key findings from the analysis was that attitudinal stance constructions were much more frequent in CSR reports than annual reports. So you can see here quite a big difference. So when talking about social and ethical and environmental issues, companies tend to use a lot more, if you like, to simplify things a little bit, emotive language. Now, when we drilled down and looked at what kind of attitudinal stance was used, we found that the desire/intention verb plus complement clause construction was the most frequent type and overwhelmingly more frequent in CSR reports compared to annual reports. So this suggests that when companies are talking about environmental and social issues, they tend to emphasize their ambitions and goals for the future. That's a staple of their sustainability discourse. This is an example of that particular strategy. Statements like, we aim to be a good neighbor to the communities close to our projects and facilities. So statements like these were very common in the corpus, and they were used rhetorically to emphasize how committed the company is, to sound ethical principles, and how much the company cares essentially about ethics and about doing the right thing. Now, when we looked at epistemic stance, we found that constructions expressing certainty were significantly more frequent in CSR reports, whereas the markers of likelihood are significantly more frequent in annual reports. And, approximating things slightly, this indicates that companies are generally more assertive in CSR reports, whereas they tend to adopt a more cautious, tentative stance in annual reports. This is an example of the use of a certainty marker in CSR reports. We know that the research and development, manufacture, and sale of our products can raise ethical issues. Now, this is an interesting use of the epistemic verb to know, because instead of actually functioning as a certainty marker, as a if you like, a pure certainty marker, it actually performs what I call in the paper a perspective taking function. That is, verbs like know, realize, understand are used in these texts to acknowledge people's concerns and to show that the company is sympathetic towards them, that the company is essentially putting themselves in people's shoes and understands what their concerns and worries and thoughts are. So through utterances such as this, companies communicate what is referred to in the trust literature as benevolence. So they aim to demonstrate that they truly care about their audience, that they truly care about us, that they're not in it just for the money. Of course, the corpus analysis is much more detailed than this, but these are the two standout features from the analysis that we decided to test in our follow-up experiments. So we found that, just to repeat, that expressions of intentions and desires are used to display a genuine commitment to business ethics and project integrity. And perspective-taking verbs such as understand, realize, and know are often used as in an attempt to display a sympathetic attitude towards stakeholders and project a benevolent corporate persona. Now, the question is, what effects do these discourse strategies have? And can these strategies be used to potentially manipulate or deceive people into thinking that the company is more ethical and caring than they actually are? Could these strategies be used to shield a company from criticism when they are accused of having done something bad? These are the questions that we explored in the follow-up experiments. And these are the questions that the corpus analysis cannot answer. There's no way you can provide a credible answer to questions like this just on the basis of the corpus analysis. So we did a study, an experimental study, and this is how it worked. So we had a group of participants, and we had a sample of participants, and we divided them into two groups. Participants in the test group were exposed to the trust-building strategies I've just discussed, and participants in the control group were not. In this way, we could conveniently measure the effect of being exposed to these trust-building strategies versus not being exposed to them. Now, all the participants read a fabricated newspaper article reporting on a whistleblower lawsuit against a fictitious pharmaceutical corporation called Avita. The article reported that a former employee of the company had accused several executives of bribing doctors to persuade them to prescribe the company's products over cheaper drugs. The article also reported that the whistleblower was allegedly fired in retaliation for exposing the scheme, and that the company had denied the accusations. So the company strongly denies the accusation, and the employee is fired, giving them potentially a motive for accusing the company. They might just be disgruntled. They might be unhappy about having been fired, and they're trying to punish the company for it. So we don't really know who is telling the truth. So that's why trust is so important in this situation. Should we trust the whistleblower or should we trust the company? Now, before reading the newspaper article, the participants in the test group also read an About Us page from the pharmaceutical company's website, which contained the same strategies that we've just talked about. And both groups of participants, after reading the stimulus texts, were asked to fill out the same questionnaire measuring their trust in the accused company. This is what the newspaper article looked like. As you can see, we tried our best to make it look really realistic, and it was based on a real story. Sorry, my headphones just died on me. Hopefully you can still hear me. Do let me know if you can't. And this is what the About Us page looked like. The trust building strategies I showed earlier were included in the second and third paragraph. And this is also based on a real About Us page, and we try to mimic it as much as possible. After seeing these texts, participants filled out a set of psychometric scales adapted from previous studies on trust. And this is an example of an item used to measure the company's integrity, and this is an item used to measure the company's benevolence. And there were more items. You can find the full questionnaire in the paper. These were our participants, around 300 people, mean age of 25. Most of them were students, although we did have also workers and people in other occupations, and they were recruited online. Okay, so what did we find? What the analysis showed, as this probably slightly convoluted diagram tries to demonstrate, is that as predicted, the trust-building strategies had a significant positive effect on both perceived benevolence and perceived integrity. That means that people who were exposed to these strategies had a more positive opinion and had more trust in the company compared to participants who were not exposed to them. Now, interestingly, and perhaps more worryingly, the trust-building strategies also had an indirect positive effect on the perceived credibility of the company's denial, which was mediated by perceived integrity, meaning that participants who were exposed to the trust-building strategies were also more likely to believe that the company was telling the truth. Now, notably, also two control variables that we included in our statistical models turned out to have a significant effect. Generalized distrust of pharmaceutical corporations was one of them. So the more negative the more cynical you are of corporations in general, the more the less you would trust this particular company. And political orientation, the more conservative you are, the more lenient you will be towards this particular company. Sorry, actually the opposite. The more progressive you are, that's it. The more progressive you are, the more cynical, which makes sense. And the more conservative, the more lenient, the more trusting of the company you would be, or our participants were. So this shows that individuals' prior attitudes and beliefs need to be taken into account as well. All right, so these are the key findings from this experimental study. So what we found is that the experimental study validates our analytical assumptions, that the features that we identified as potentially influencing people's trust do actually influence people's trust. You cannot do this just on the basis of the experiment of the corpus analysis alone. So by presenting themselves as sympathetic to public concerns and committed to business ethics, corporations are able to enhance public perceptions of their trustworthiness. Now, more concerning is the fact that also these trust-building strategies had this indirect positive effect on the perceived credibility of the company's denial. This implies that blameworthy, unethical companies may exploit communication as a strategic tool to stockpile trust and protect their legitimacy against future acts or accusations of wrongdoing. And this is particularly concerning because large corporations are routinely found to engage in various kinds of nasty misconduct. All right, so that was the first case study, and it looked at corporate discourse. The second case study that illustrates this integration of corpus and experimental methods looks at social media, and specifically, it looks at how blame spreads on Twitter and the role of evaluative language in promoting the spread of blame. This study is also a two-part study that I did in collaboration with two brilliant colleagues of mine, Sten Hansen from Tartu University in Estonia and Ruth Page from Birmingham. And like in the previous study, this is also a two-part study. In the first one, we did a corpus analysis of a corpus of tweets posted by people criticizing the UK government for Brexit and COVID-19. And their handling of these two events. And in the experimental study, we then tested how different kinds of blaming strategies affect other people on social media. And the overarching aim of this dual study is to understand how citizens hold governments accountable and how so-called political blame games play out in social media. So in the corpus study, briefly, we looked at, we tried to identify blaming strategies different types of blaming strategies used by people on Twitter to hold the government to account. So we compiled two very large corpora of tweets aimed at UK politicians, and as I said, discussing the issues of Brexit and COVID-19 that became two massive blame storms on Twitter, with a lot of people commenting on them and blaming, really being very vocal about blaming politicians. And we used appraisal theory to annotate these tweets and to identify different blaming strategies. And essentially, we found that blaming strategies used by people on Twitter can be described in terms of two key dimensions: the evaluative basis of blaming, so what the politician is blamed for, whether it's their lack of competence or lack of sincerity or unethical behavior or their lack of tenacity, and the focus of blaming, so whether the Twitter user was criticizing the politician for what they're doing, or so their behavior, or for their character, or for the outcome of their actions. Let me give you a couple of examples to illustrate this difference, or two of these strategies. So first one, we all know the Australian deal is effectively no deal. Resign, please, and find someone competent to take over. So in this tweet, the basis of blame is the politician's capacity, so they're criticized for not being competent, and the focus is on their character. So their incompetence is presented, is framed as something permanent, as something that inherent in their personality. The second one, you've lied, distorted, and misled us all the way, and we have had enough. Here, the basis of blame is the politician's veracity, so they're presented as insincere, and the focus of blaming is their behavior, so the behavior of lying and distorting the truth and misleading. So that's, to show you how we went about coding the data. There's a lot more detail in the paper, of course, but let's move on to the experiment, which is what I would like to emphasize here. So again, corpus analysis can be used to describe linguistic patterns of language use. It cannot tell us anything about how people respond to these different choices. So to address this follow-up question, we developed a set of hypotheses about the effects of these different strategies, specifically on how strongly on the strength of the criticism as perceived by the participants, and how retweetable these different strategies, these different types of tweets, people consider them to be. And this is a diagram showing our predictions. So we hypothesized that tweets blaming a politician for lying, so veracity, are going to have a stronger effect and be more perceived as more negative than those blaming the politician for their lack of competence. And this is based on the trust literature, which I don't have time to go into, but I can discuss later in the Q&A after this. And then in terms of the focus of blame, we hypothesized that blaming tweets targeting the character of the politician will be perceived as the most critical, followed by behavior and outcome as targets. Now, we also hypothesized that the stronger the perceived level of criticism, the more negative a tweet is perceived to be, the more retweetable it is also perceived to be initially. This is what we hypothesized based on a lot of the literature on viral language and virality online, which has shown time and again that negative content gets shared more keenly and more enthusiastically by people. So we designed the experiment and as follows. Participants were shown a vignette setting out a scenario. Then they saw a government announcement via Twitter, which was followed by an example of blaming language directed at the politician, and then an experimental task where people were asked to essentially rate the level of negativity and retweetability of the tweets. So this is the scenario where the UK government is announcing that they're ditching their greenhouse grant scheme to essentially give people subsidies to insulate their homes. This is based on a real case. And we try to avoid very divisive issues like Brexit or COVID, because people then wouldn't necessarily respond to the language specifically, but would go off their preconceived ideas and beliefs mainly. Then they saw the announcement by the politician, a made-up politician named John Smith, where they're announcing and justifying why they're doing this. And that was followed by an example of Twitter users, Rob White, obviously made up here, but this was meant to get people in the mood for, or get people to understand and immerse themselves and imagine what it would like to see this kind of language online. So we ran two studies, tweaking slightly the experimental design. In the first study, we asked people to essentially group tweets into bins that describe different levels of negativity and different levels of retweetability. And they can put these, they could drag these tweets into whichever box they wanted. They could even put them into all one box that was, up to them. And these are the results of the first study. What we found is that, as predicted, as you can see, people tended to rate tweets attacking a politician's character as very critical. Mostly as very critical, whereas they tended to rate the other ones, especially outcome ones, less often as very critical and more often as somewhat critical or not critical. Now, contrary to what we expected, what we found here is that in terms of retweetability, the tweets that were perceived as most critical were perceived as the least retweetable. You see how much non-retweetable ratings we have here, a much bigger proportion compared to the other ones. So that already suggests that our hypotheses about retweetability might be flawed. All right, so we followed that up with a slightly different design. And this time, what we also studied is the intersection or interaction between focus and basis of blame, which we didn't in the first study. So we wanted to see how these two variables intersect. And instead of having people put the tweets into boxes, we had them rate each individual tweet on a scale from non-critical to very critical and from non-retweetable to very retweetable. And these are the results. what you can see here is that the tweets that were perceived as the most critical and most negative were those that attacked a politician's character, as we saw before. Interestingly, here, when the focus of blame was on character, the basis of blame did not matter, as you can see here. But there was a difference in the two other focus conditions. Interestingly, what we found is confirming the first study is that the most negative tweets are the least retweetable, not the most retweetable, as we anticipated. And there was also a pattern of statistically significant interaction between the two variables, where the most retweetable tweets were in fact those based on outcomes and where the politician is accused of being insincere. So we found then confirmation for the first hypothesis that veracity blaming was perceived as the most critical, more critical than capacity blaming. And this is in line with previous work on trust and lots of political opinion surveys. We also find that blaming strategies focused on character and behavior were regarded as more critical than those focused on outcomes. And this kind of aligns really neatly with, literature in CDA that shows that essentially when through, for instance, transitivity choices, agency is backgrounded, people tend to struggle a little bit more to see or are prone to be less blameful towards a particular social actor. This is a recurring theme in the CDA literature, going back to early work in the late 80s in critical linguistics. And when we saw, and another thing that we observed is that when blame is focused on character alone, the basis of the blame no longer matters. You can see the two lines here completely and neatly intersecting, so that, it's just essentially those, regardless of what the politician is accused of, if their character is being attacked, then that's the most negative form of blaming. Now, from the point of view of retweetability, what we uncovered is goes against our initial hypothesis. Surprisingly, we found that the blaming strategies focused on a person's character, which we expected to be highly critical, and therefore, based on literature on virality, would have been perceived as the most retweetable, as the most newsworthy, if you like. But what we found is what we call the retweetability paradox, namely that blaming strategies regarded as the most critical were regarded as the least retweetable. And in fact, strategies regarded as the least critical were the ones that were perceived as the most retweetable. Now, there are different reasons for this that we explore in the paper. So it shows how essentially, contrary to earlier claims and previous studies that talk about how political discourse on Twitter is generally uncivil, we find that actually at least our participants had quite a keen awareness of their Twitter face, and they were orienting to implicit ideals of civility and civil behavior online. We also included in the questionnaire some open-ended questions that were very helpful for us to get some context about what people were thinking when responding to our questions, and a lot of them commented on the fact that when talking about facts and outcomes, those tweets were perceived as more informative, therefore more useful. And the tweets blaming the politician's character were not seen as informative as those, and so that's partly why they wanted or they thought they would be more retweetable. All right, so those were the key findings from the second case study. In conclusion, I just want to briefly come back to the main takeaways, the main argument that I'm trying to deliver in this talk, which is hopefully these two case studies have helped support and illustrate. and the argument is that by combining corpus-assisted discourse analysis and experiments, we can do a number of useful things. We can overcome analytical circularity by collecting non-linguistic data about patterns of thought, attitudes, and behavior, and go beyond this implicit pseudo-deterministic approach that is still very much a feature of a lot of CDA and CADS. We also need to get a more nuanced and less deterministic. This also enables us to get more nuance about how people react, and sometimes identify patterns that are not observable through corpus discourse analysis alone, and that can only be discovered through experimental or similar kinds of methods. For instance, the fact that explicit character blaming backfires. We cannot tell that from the language use alone. And by incorporating experiments, we can also add explanatory and predictive power to our analysis. That's all I had. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. I hope that made sense, and I look forward to your questions.